Omega. Let us celebrate.
We learn that me ye cannot slay.
The dynasty of the Sackler family began in 1952 when brothers Arthur, Mortimer, and Raymond purchased a small pharmaceutical company and became pioneers of medical marketing. A generation later, that pharmaceutical company became known as Purdue Pharma. In 1995, under the leadership of Raymond's son Richard, Purdue introduced the United States to its medical miracle, the magical capsule that could melt pain away and give people back their lives. Except it did anything but that. So, how could an entire pharmaceutical company not realize they were selling candy-coated addictions? You know what, let me rephrase that. How much profit made it acceptable to ignore that fact? There you go. Over the span of the company's existence, Purdue earned $31 billion in revenue, with the majority of that wealth going right back into the pockets of the Sackler family. So the Sackler family, as part of that settlement, would have to cough up just $225 million of their personal wealth, which is less than 2.5% of the total amount of money they withdrew from Purdue solely during the peak of the crisis from 2008 to 2017. Oh, and they were also allowed to continue to admit no wrongdoing and not face any criminal charges. The Clay crime family was formed by Lincoln Clay in 1968 as a result of his desire for revenge against Sal Marcano and the Marcano crime family for family. Throughout the summer and fall of 1968, Lincoln waged his war on Sal's operations, dismantling them one by one and putting his own people in their place. Afterwards, Lincoln met with Leo Galante, who came to New Bordeaux on behalf of the commission. After Lincoln assured Leo that he had no quarrel with them, the two came to an agreement that Lincoln could have New Bordeaux and run it any way he pleases, as long as he kicked up 20% to the commission once a month. Now, the family runs various rackets in all 9 districts of New Bordeaux, covering everything from auto theft to waste disposal, including a lot of lucrative businesses that are run by Mitch DaCosta. Lucy Beland, also known as Ma Beland, was based in Fort Worth, Texas, and she and her offspring sold a lot of fun things. Things that make you feel good. No snow. Spicy spoon juice. These members were convicted of a lot of crimes. I mean, like, at least 30 convictions between 1921 to 1947. In 1911, her son Charles impaled another boy and was charged with causing physical harm, but later released on probation. And later that year, daughter Willie was caught as part of a shoplifting ring of a dozen girls. By the way, turns out Ma had organized that whole shoplifting school. Goodness gracious. Willie and Cora were arrested once again for shoplifting in 1912. Willie was arrested also one more time in 1912 for possession of no snow. I think between 1921 to 1947, there was at least 30 charges, folks. There's a lot to talk about here. The Columbo crime family is the youngest of the 5 families that dominate organized crime in New York City. They trace their roots to a bootlegging gang that was formed by Joseph Profaci in 1928. Now, this family's been torn apart by at least 3 internal wars. In 1991, the third and worst one erupted when acting boss Victor Orena tried to seize power from Carmine. If you know, you know. The family split into factions loyal to Orena and Persico, and 2 years of mayhem ensued. Now, this ended in 1993 with 12 family members imprisoned, leaving Persico the winner more or less by default. Once again, their crimes as long as my arm, folks. While the Borgias are more associated with the Renaissance period and the Papal States than ancient Rome, their reputation for political intrigue, poisonings, and assassinations, and makes them one of the most notorious families in Roman history. At the heart of this nefarious clan was Rodrigo Borgia, who in 1492 ascended to the papal throne as Pope Alexander. His reign was marked by a brazen display of nepotism, as he elevated his illegitimate offspring, Caesar and Lucrezia, to positions of power and influence within the Vatican.
Medieval England was a very chaotic place, and numerous criminal and militia groups popped up and began making mischief, to put it lightly. The Fulvilles were an impoverished noble family that used their connections and meager wealth to gather a band of soldiers and begin robbing, extorting, and confining people to make their money. Their big claim to fame, though, is the significant amount of vengeance and political action they undertook, hunting down corrupt lords, or often the lords that tried to cut down on the Fulvilles' corruption. They sided against the Despensers in the Despenser Civil War and made a habit of ransoming off nobles and justices. Despite their own wealth, they were often viewed as a Robin Hood-like family, hunting down corrupt nobles and lords. Next is the Italian Mafia. When referring to the Italian Mafia, we're talking specifically about the American Italian Mafia, because in Italy, they don't call it the Italian Mafia. It was was by being brought to America that multiple different conflicting Italian groups were brought together under the title of Italian. The Italian mob, like most organized crime, was born out of poverty and racism, as they were not allowed to work the same jobs and given the same opportunities as local Americans. So the Italians banded together along with the criminals from Italy and formed the Mafia. The Mafia was insanely powerful, especially during the periods of the Second World War and the Prohibition era, but they exist and are active to this day. In fact, they were so powerful and influential that the United States secretly enlisted them to help crack down on spies, saboteurs, strikers, and smugglers during the Second World War. This helped them become the most powerful organized crime syndicate in America and led to a decades-long dominance of the American continent. Next is the Gabrielli family. As Jews from around the world were brought to the colonial state of Israel, they brought their own cultures, creeds, and yes, criminals. Moroccan, Russian, Georgian, and Arab Jews all had their own criminal syndicates and all began actively working within and outside Israel. However, perhaps one of the most famous is the Gabrielli family. We don't know for 100% certain that the Gabrielli family are a syndicate, and so for my own legal protection, this is all alleged. But allegedly, Ezra Gabrielli was a powerful crime boss involved in significant racketeering, extortion, trafficking, and much more. His daughter Inbal Gabrielli would join the right-wing Likud party, gain a seat in the Knesset, and use her parliamentary immunity to shut down raids on her father's home and investigations into his tax fraud. It's believed the Gabrielli are closely connected or a part of the Abergil organization, a well-known criminal syndicate in Israel. Next is the Georgian Mafia. The Georgian Mafia are, you guessed it, based out of Georgia, with a split between the cities of Tbilisi and Kutaisi. Unlike other ethnic mobs, the Georgian Mafia has no requirement you be a Georgian to join, which has allowed them to spread throughout multiple nations. It began before the Soviet period, and it's likely that Stalin himself gained power through the Georgian Mafia, using that money to fund his rise into the heights of the Soviet Union. Their close ties to the foundation of modern Russia has allowed them to worm their way deeply into most of the Warsaw Pact and all former Soviet states, making them one of the most powerful, influential, and widespread syndicates in global history.
If you want to talk about ghosts, then who are you going to call? Well, you should actually probably call Dan Aykroyd. His fascination with the paranormal started because his great-grandfather was a spiritualist who held seances. Turns out there's a whole book called History of Ghosts written by Dan's dad, and it's about mediumship and his interest in it. He was the reviewer of all these psychic acts who came through town. He was associated with the Lily Dale community in New York, where you can go and get a reading from a registered psychic, and that got passed on throughout the family. They wanted to know what was going on. They wanted to know how levitation was possible, how ectoplasm is possible. Well, that all checks. The story of Mark and his family's eerie encounter with a cursed Ouija board infested home in Australia started off subtle, like their dog's reluctance to enter the house, originally dismissed as a mere adjustment to the new environment. But then, as things do, they escalated. Let's see, there was the mysterious flooding in the laundry room, shattered light bulbs, an overwhelming sense of unease in certain areas of the house that signaled something far more sinister. Disembodied laughter, shuffling feet, and phantom voices only intensified their torment. As the supernatural disturbances grew unbearable, the family decided to take action. The mom's brave confrontation with the paranormal, reading Bible verses aloud, was met with the spirit's fury, resulting in potential poltergeist activity. The peak of this terrifying tale came when the youngest member of the family miraculously survived a fall from an open window. This event was the final straw, prompting them to flee the cursed house without looking back. Burari, a nondescript neighborhood in the Indian capital of Delhi, attained notoriety after 11 members of the Chandawat family were found dead inside their home, amid whispers of occult practices. So police say 10 of them were dangling from the ceiling, and their hands were tied behind their backs, and their eyes and mouths were covered with cloth. And police have zeroed in on one of the men in the family, one Lalit Chandawat. So documents and phones that were recovered from the house hinted at Lalit's interest in spirits and ghosts. Police believe he frequently visited crematoriums, obsessively watched paranormal content, and notes found in one of the diaries hint at a strong belief that supernatural forces would intervene and save the family. And apparently it motivated the family to do what they did. The notes in the diaries laid out exactly how the family needed to carry out this act before they were to have been saved. And it looks like a lot of these instructions were carried out. These notes also refer to Thursday or Sunday as the chosen days, and police believe the deaths occurred between late Saturday night and early Sunday morning. The diaries listed out that the family needed to cover their eyes and mouths with a cloth during the ritual, and that's where we're going to end that because I'm not telling you how to do this. One night, Lorraine Warren received a voicemail from a Mrs. Sandy Foster, who nervously described a very distressing situation and begged the Warrens to return her call. Although it was 12:40 in the morning, Lorraine immediately tried to call her back, and while the phone rang, the connection wouldn't connect. The next day, Ed and Lorraine made the decision to go pay the Fosters a visit, just to be safe. Well, Mrs. Foster brought up that her daughter Meg had been really interested in the occult and had actually purchased a book on conjuring as a gift for her daughter. And based off the description of it, I think it was a copy of the Ars Goetia. The family described a plethora of instances of demonic activity, and Lorraine herself experienced an inhuman presence throughout the home. So Ed told the family he and Lorraine could handle everything, but hey, maybe just get out of the house for a little bit while we do what we gotta do. So they got to work the moment the Fosters left. They were determined to discover the true nature of the spirit's presence in order to dispel it. After a lot of work, they managed to do so, but not without a struggle. Bob Smith's fascination with this seemingly innocent painting turned into a haunting mystery when a kitchen fire devastated his grandmother's house, leaving only the painting unscathed. The eerie connection deepened when Bob later learned that the very same painting had caused similar tragedies in other households. Giovanni Bragalin's series of paintings, of which The Crying Boy was a part of, became notorious. In 1985, the Sun newspaper in the UK published a shocking account of May and Ron Hall, whose home was consumed by fire with only the cursed painting surviving unharmed. And what's truly unsettling is the firefighter's claim that he had witnessed multiple house fires where everything was reduced to ashes except for copies of The Crying Boy. The widespread reports of similar incidents fueled the belief in the painting's curse, leading to a wave of fear and destruction. Ultimately, the Sun's bonfire of these paintings marked the end of their popularity, but a few copies still linger, carrying with them the ominous aura of the inexplicable. A doll originally belonging to Robert Eugene Otto, an artist, was described as eccentric once upon a time. Neighbors of Robert used to hear him having a conversation with the doll, and this continued into his adult years. He brought the doll everywhere. He talked about it in the first person, as if it wasn't a doll, as if Robert was his own being. Well, the doll remained stored in the Otto family home until Robert the human passed away in 1974. After his death, a couple bought the house, and their daughter found the doll in the attic, and she claimed that the doll was trying to kill her. So the family got rid of it. The doll is now on display in a museum in Key West, and don't worry, the doll still curses people. His last caretaker before the museum experienced him disappear and reappear as he pleased. They heard footsteps, they heard giggling in the attic. Some folks even claim that Robert's expression changes when anybody badmouths Otto in his presence. He's also been responsible for a couple of car crashes, some divorces, broken bones, so go near him at your own risk. The Julio-Claudian dynasty was the first imperial dynasty of Rome. They had the first 5 emperors: Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero. While they had some accomplished rulers like Augustus, they also had emperors infamous for their cruelty and excess. We're talking Caligula, Nero. Among the many dynasties that ruled over this sprawling empire, this one stands out as one of the most unsettling. They were a roller coaster ride of power, intrigue, and brutality. But it's not just the heinous emperors that make this dynasty so spine-chilling. Caligula is infamous for his very bizarre, very awful antics, which included making his horse a consul and reveling in cruelty. And then Tiberius. A lot of debauchery, a lot of tyranny, a lot of things I can't talk about. The Kelly family was an American family of killers who operated between August and December of 1887 near a town called Oak City, just south of the Kansas state border in No Man's Land, now the Oklahoma Panhandle. So this was a family led by William Kelly, his wife Kate. They also had Bill and Kit, the offspring. Originally from Pennsylvania, this family killed at least 11 wealthy travelers. Initially dealing with cattle, they soon opened a tavern, and they housed fellow cattlers and travelers. But in the span of a couple of months, a number of people had disappeared mysteriously along the road leading to the tavern. Despite this, nobody suspected the family of doing anything until around December, when the occupants suddenly left the house without notifying anybody. Well, a short while afterwards, a traveler from St. Louis named S.T. Gregg, who had visited there before, decided to stop by, check it out. Upon entry, a foul stench overtook him, coming from a hidden cellar underneath the house. The bodies of not 1, not 2, but 3 men, already in an advanced state of decomposition, were discovered, as well as a trapdoor underneath the tavern's floor. News came through that all 4 members of the Kelly family had passed through Beaver a few days prior en route to New Mexico. So, angry posse formed. They were like, okay, come on, let's go get this family. Then it turns out they were going towards Texas. After a while, the posse did catch up with them. There was a 2-hour-long chase. Eventually, Kate's horse tripped. Kate fell to the ground, breaking her neck in the process, so she was left behind. And then a half an hour later, the vigilantes caught up with Bill and Kit, but Bill managed to escape. Upon capture, Kip began pleading for mercy, only to be told off for being complicit in everything. And as you guessed it, that was the end of that family. Apart from the Julio-Claudian dynasty mentioned earlier, the Claudi were also a powerful family in their own right. So, at the top of the family, Tiberius. His rule was marked by a dark undercurrent of intrigue and cruelty. He withdrew from public life to the island of Capri, where a lot of rumors of debauchery and some lethal things swirled around him. But don't worry, sinister legacy does not end here. Great nephew, Emperor Nero, oh boy, goes on to commit unspeakable acts of tyranny. We're talking persecution, killing, taking out his mom, and the family's intricate web of alliances and betrayals is just kind of a standout in Roman history, which is saying something. The darkest chapters in Roman history remain a haunting testament. Edward Harold Bell was an American killer and the first fugitive to be featured in the Texan rendition of America's Most Wanted. According to his claims, his father, an oil field worker, frequently moved the family to various towns surrounding the Houston area, and allegedly suffered physical harm from both him, his scoutmasters at the Boy Scouts, and one of his cousins. Bell would also later claim in interviews that his father encouraged him to do violent crimes. We're talking robbing banks, taking advantage of women in a carnal fashion, and encouraging him to take his own life. Following his capture in Panama City, in 1993, he was extradited, convicted, and sentenced to a 70-year term for the killing of a Marine in 1978, and later confessed to killing 11 girls. The Wolf Pack is believed to have been formed as early as 2010, but it wasn't until the 2012 Toronto killing of John Raposo that this group gained national attention. Turns out, the resulting trial heard that Raposo was involved in a deal with the Wolf Pack, but was killed over unsubstantiated rumors that he was a police informant. So going back to 2018, 4 men were found guilty of first-degree killing and conspiracy. They were all tied to the Wolf Pack. One of those men, Rabbi Akahil, was apparently the top-level brains of the Wolf Pack. Apparently he's very smart, very mobile, and very ruthless. Somebody you don't want to get on the wrong side of, which is kind of exactly why the killing of Raposo happened in a very public space, as opposed to how, most killings are done privately.
Next are the Yakuza. There are a dozen Yakuza syndicates, with Yakuza really just meaning gangster. They originated in the Edo period, which began in the 1600s, and many have existed continuously for the 300 to 400 years since. They formed out of the tekiya, the peddlers, and one of the lowest social classes, who began to organize themselves for protection. This then evolved into the highly structured modern Yakuza, where larger families hold influence over smaller families beneath them, much like a medieval fief system. These more powerful families are heavily integrated into Japanese society, being deeply entwined in many legal and illegal industries and companies, the most powerful being the Yamaguchi Gumi. Nintendo, Pride FC, and many other Japanese companies and organizations chose to or had to work closely with the Yakuza, mostly because the Yakuza hold some of the greatest wealth and capital in the entire nation. However, modern efforts to recriminalize the Yakuza and divide them from the public have helped in restricting corruption and collusion. Next is the Sicilian Mafia. Remember when I said we don't call them the Italian Mafia if they're in Italy? That's because every region has their own organized crime, but the most famous and notorious are the Sicilians. Located on the island of Sicily, they've had a hand in extortion, racketeering, smuggling, robbing, loan sharking, and election rigging since the early 1800s. Just for an example, the red dots on this map of Sicily indicate a city or town that has mafia presence in the year 1900. You may notice the almost complete lack of black dots, especially in the west, where the island faces away from the Italian peninsula and smugglers can work more freely. They still exist, having survived all the turmoil in Italy in the last 200 years, and were a key component in the founding of the Italian Mafia in America. Next is the Triad. The Triad began as a political action club organized with the intent of overthrowing the ruling Qing dynasty. They were not a strict group, and so some sided with the Kuomintang, some sided with the capitalists, and some with the communists. But when the Chinese Civil War resolved itself, it soon became clear that organized crime was no longer going to be ignored or used against internal enemies. Mao and later Deng Xiaoping would heavily crack down on the Triad, which led to its splitting and fleeing across Southeast Asia. They relocated to Hong Kong, Taiwan, Malaysia, Vietnam, and numerous other Southeast Asian nations and still operate out of them. In the time since, this secret society has moved away from political ambitions and towards outright criminal ones. There are simply so many though that picking a single family is an exercise in picking the cleanest floorboard in a house fire. All of them are pretty bad. Next is the Scarfo mob. Of all the mafia families, it is often the Scarfo mob that are considered the most notorious. This is mostly due to Nicodemo Scarfo, the boss when it all came crumbling down. Nicky was cruel and vindictive, and while other families would be happy with a cunning revenge of undercutting profits or exposing enemies to the police or outmaneuvering the other families, Nicodemo's favorite and most used tactic was horrifying violence. It's no coincidence that the Scarfo family experienced its bloodiest years under Nicodemo's rule. However, after he became suspicious of his favored hitman, Nicodemo ordered him put down. You don't exactly get to be the main hitman of the mob for years straight without learning to watch your back, and Caramandi ran to the authorities, gaining immunity in return for putting 11 mobsters behind bars under 52 charges. Next are the Coterelles. The Coterelles were sort of the classic medieval brigands and bandits, living in the woods, engaging in highway robbery and political extortion. Because yes, you could become a powerful political figure in 1300s Britain by being a good enough robber and ransomer, but they would become most famous after they captured the man sent to capture them, Richard Willoughby, and then ransomed him off. They lived in Sherwood Forest, had issues with the Sheriff of Nottingham, and eventually shut down their criminal enterprise to become a war band in support of Queen Philippa. Sort of like Robin Hood, but not quite. And lastly are the Lions of Hussein. Based in Syria, the Lions of Hussein were initially an Assad-friendly criminal syndicate that engaged in smuggling, ransom, extortion, and theft. However, after the civil war erupted in 2011, the group moved more towards becoming a pro-Assad militia, but still maintained many of their criminal ties and made most of their funds through illegal means. However, after their founder's death in 2015, they reorganized and rebranded into the Lions of Hussein, a now explicit paramilitary in support of the Assad regime and Ba'athist party.
Famed AEW wrestler Malachi Black has a fascination with the occult because he grew up in a household that had some very disturbing and interesting things. So he knows how to create these cult-like characters on TV because, well, he grew up with it. He understands it. It was something that had a great influence on him because his grandfather would tell him incredible stories about, and well, once again folks, we're gonna get bizarre here. He would tell him stories about things that he witnessed with black magic in Malaysia. There was a type of voodoo that they used that was called guna guna, and the grandfather got involved with that. He saw it happening around the camps. Things were strung up and soldiers were sick and they couldn't find what was going on. And the villagers were like, oh, he's being subjected to this voodoo, which kind of sparked Malachi's interest. When he was growing up, he was exposed to a lot of perhaps strange things, but it really shaped his mind into questioning everything and looking at the world very differently than a lot of folks. And it made for a very interesting upbringing. He said there was a lot of difficult moments and a lot of very, very difficult growing up, very disconnected moments. It was definitely not your run-of-the-mill upbringing, but it was interesting. One night, very late at night, Ed and Lorraine Warren were contacted by the Snedeker family, who had just moved into a house on Meriden Avenue in Southington. Specifically, the mother of the family unit and a niece who came to stay with the family were on the phone. And what they found and bought, they were like, oh yeah, we had this new home. It's big and welcoming. Turns out it was a former funeral home. And the morticians at that funeral home were involved in naughty things with the dead. The sons of this new family, they were the first to start talking about the things they had seen and experienced. They were terrified. And at first the parents were like, come on guys. But these boys were so scared they were sleeping on the floor in the living room. The women who called the Warrens were terrified. They were hiding in a small bedroom in the back of the house, and the covers on the bed around them were levitating like there was a fan blowing them around. And Lorraine said that while they were on the phone, even more bizarre events started happening. The mother had rosary beads in her hand, and while she spoke, the beads were actually being pulled apart and falling to the floor. A blessing of the house seemed to do nothing to calm things down. The church eventually sent an exorcist, which seemed to do the trick, but not before one last hurrah from whatever was doing all this chaos. So there was this huge tree in front of the house, right? And half of the tree, with no wind, broke off and fell on the property. Yeah, I'd be hightailing it out of there after that. In the chilling case of the Perron family, their seemingly serene farmhouse in Rhode Island concealed a dark and malevolent secret. Soon after moving in, strange occurrences were unraveling, initially dismissed as minor inconveniences. Brooms moved on their own. The young daughters were seeing apparitions. Carolyn Perron, determined to uncover the truth, delved into the history of the house and discovered a lineage plagued by mysterious and tragic deaths spanning 8 generations. The most ominous presence of that was of Bathsheba Sherman. Bathsheba's malevolent intentions became evident as the family's life spiraled into a nightmare. One harrowing incident involved Carolyn experiencing an inexplicable puncture wound on her calf, resembling a large sewing impalement. This unsettling occurrence was just one of many tormenting episodes endured by the Perron family over their decade-long residency in the house, known as the Old Arnold Estate. Now the Warrens were summoned to help because who else? And they identified a mysterious box, which they believed acted as a conduit for Bathsheba's demonic energy to afflict the household. So they performed their blessings, they removed the malevolent object, and lived to tell the tale. Patty Donovan's innocent curiosity led her down a treacherous path when she engaged with a Ouija board, believing she'd found a friend through the board. And as she grew emotionally dependent on this entity, the malevolent spirit, once her confidant, turned into a demonic force, wreaking havoc on her entire family. It targeted their vehicles, it disassembled engines, it punctured tires. Things escalated. We're talking crazy vandalism around the home, inexplicable damage to the property, to the point of levitating furniture, rocks raining down on the house. Father Ted Donovan's desperation led him to seek help from Ed and Lorraine Warren. So upon their arrival, they knew right away there was some malevolence, and they found out about the Ouija board. So they realized, okay, this is bad, and they initiated the process for an exorcism, which sadly took a month to be granted. So during that time, the family endured more torment and destruction at the hands of the entities. Finally, exorcism takes place, liberating the family from their demonic ordeal. But they're left with a substantial financial burden because, well, extensive damage.
Cut cult is number 10, and they quite literally cut themselves out of a different cult, Summit Lighthouse, their origin. In 1975, founder Elizabeth Blair Prophet pitched herself and her husband as messengers of ascended masters who were believed to be spiritually awakened ancient beings. Because of branching off of one cult wasn't apparently enough, this couple tossed in some other cult elements from Christian Science, the I Am movement, and general doomsday cults. Mix that together and shake, and you've got a married couple siphoning money out of growing congregation members to buy land in Montana, which was to be their apocalyptic safe haven. Members worked themselves to the bone and drove themselves into debt, clamoring to reserve a spot in the safe haven and build their fallout shelters. This cult held their flock from leaving by stranding them in this haven, now bankrupt and with nowhere else to go. They used tactics like sleep deprivation and manipulation against any who tried to depart. The prophet retired, not died, just retired one day in 1999 and passed in 2009. Since, the church is still run, but with endless legal issues and succession debates. Builders of Adatom is number 9, and it's a super chill group if you can get behind mystic rituals, magic, prophecies, and clairvoyancy. Paul Foster Case, a Catholic Freemason, founded this group in 1922. He combed the teachings of esoteric with tarot cards, Masonic imagery, and the Kabbalah. Quite a power combo. Anyways, Case saw himself as not divinity, but a man sent to, quote, accept the enormous responsibility of founding an order dedicated to the welfare of all of mankind. And that's kind of what he's done. This group has had a following of 5,000 members worldwide, excluding those followers who don't pay the membership dues. Like Jesus, who many believed was trained in the Kabbalah, members of BOTA aspired to build the inner temple, to construct the Holy of Holies within. People of all faiths are welcome to study the teachings of this order. There has been some rumors that BOTA won't allow any LGBT members to advance in their spiritual journey past a certain level as they are considered unbalanced, but with exception to that, this cult is pretty tame. No money laundering, no frauds, no harming of its followers. It's devoted to the study of mystic rituals, magic, religion, tarot, and ancient spirituality. It wants to sell you a lot of books and lessons, but that's about as dark as it gets. They even have known physicists, authors, and astrologers as part of their group. After the passing of Paul Foster Case, Ann Davis took over the leadership, but she's not as favored as the past Paul. Overall, they're said to have a slow and comfortable process and explanation of their information and practices. You can check out their website as well. Cults go Hollywood with number 8 in the countdown, the Atheria Society. Known for its residency on Hollywood Boulevard in Los Angeles, this bizarre group starts in the 1950s with leader Dr. George King, who one day says to have received a cosmic transmission from the Interplanetary Parliament that explained that Atherius, an alien from Venus, was our next messiah. King also believed himself to have spoken with many entities he saw as godlike cosmic beings or masters. Jesus is also one of those, and also from Venus BTW, and the Lord Buddha is another. Naturally, like many cults, Atherius has predicted the apocalypse. However, the Atherians of the past and present aren't doom mongers like many other apocalyptic cults. While they know it's coming, they weren't told when. The Atherians are also quite existential, practicing self-awareness and meditation, and are acutely aware of global climate issues and politics that affect the currents of our society and our planet. At the center of the Atheria Society is a belief that around the world there are 19 holy mountains, each individually really imbued with cosmic significance by George King. Mount Baldy in California is the object of their frequent pilgrimages. With energy they create from their prayer, stored in a crystalline battery and transmitted via radio signal, they endeavor to maintain global peace. You can check out this tranquil but bizarre cult on their website or their Facebook page. Classic rom-com or just comedic? Number 7 is Full Circle Cult. Why the glib comment? Well, this cult is founded and run by Andrew Keegan, best known for his role as Joey in 10 Things I Hate About You. So how did he go from acting to culting? In 2014, Keegan started his new spiritual movement aimed at spiritual millennials in hip and upbeat Venice, California. And Keegan's cult advertised itself as advanced spiritualism, or the highest spiritualism founded on universal knowledge. They also enjoy ayahuasca. This cult offers workshops and community meet and greets that allow for public interaction. Every week, a diverse group of congregants will take part in yoga, cultural gatherings, and ceremonies inside the 110-year-old temple at 305 Rose Avenue, one of the oldest buildings in Venice, California. It's also been used as a temple for multiple religions before this cult, which was probably part of the renter's appeal for Keegan. A year into running, Keegan faced fines for the distribution and sales of alcohol without a license when undercover ABC agents confiscated several containers of kombucha that were apparently brewed a little too strongly. This group has also been known to enjoy a little bit of the Mary Jane on the side too. While we don't know if there's any sinister intent in this group, we do know that it has struggled. Due to big companies like Google and Snapchat moving into the area, rent got too high for the group by 2017, and they're forced to leave their temple. Keegan promises though that the cult isn't over, and rather a new level is coming, including sound healing, education, medical type practices, food, and health. This name changer of a cult is number 6, it's the Moonies. Founded by Sungyoung Moon in 1940s Korea, this cult is now called the Unification Church and has had many other names. While born in North Korea, he was eventually imprisoned there under a false accusation from the government, and when released, Moon fled to South Korea. Before this had occurred, Moon had already been preaching and had his first vision of Jesus appearing to him with the task to establish God's kingdom on earth. With his newfound prison freedom, Moon started his church in South Korea, a mix of Confucian and Christian beliefs mixed with divine prophecies. With that, Moon created the new Bible. Unlike many other cults, this one got big, sitting at around 10,000 members in its prime. When Moon held the infamous mass weddings, they required stadiums for the thousands of attendees. A rejecter of romantic love, weddings were the holy marriage blessing ceremony, a core ritual at which couples are removed from the lineage of sinful humanity and engrafted into God's sinless lineage. In the 70s, the Moonies made their way to the US, where they reportedly separated college students from their families through brainwashing. They've also been accused of deceptive recruiting methods, practices, and manipulative financial frauds. This cult has faced lawsuits, government scrutiny, and even had 400 of its members abducted in the 70s and 80s for cult deprogramming. Moon died in 2012, and the religion broke off into 3 factions, each following a family member. Some follow his widow, who many consider to be a messiah and is now the founder of the Women's Federation for World Peace International. Others followed his eldest son to his Family Peace Association, and others followed his youngest son to the Sanctuary Church. I guess cult leader can be genetic. Freedomites are number 5, and they are a subcult of a cult first started in Russia as an opposition to materialistic and governed society. Called the Doukhobors, I'm not sure if I say it right, they came to Canada in 1899 fleeing persecution in Russia. Here they became the Freedomites, who insisted on 3 things: communal living, nudity, and anarchy. The Freedomites are a peaceful people, periodically setting fire to their shacks and then stripping naked and hurling their clothes into the flames. They became most famous for their all-nude public demonstrations to show opposition to the materialistic tendencies of society: taxes, economy, money, etc. And in the 20s and 30s, they even stripped naked publicly to burn and detonate a whole slew of buildings to show their disdain for the government. They had been held accountable for 1,112 depredations and have caused 20 million in damage and taken 20 lives. In 1961, we saw the arrest of 120 Freedomites planning national sieges. The prisoners were of course sent to BC's Agassiz fireproof prison, which prevent the Freedomites from doing their favorite thing: burning it down. A book titled Terror in the Name of God, a study of Doukhobors, written by Vancouver newswoman Sima Holt, highlighted Freedomite contentions and factually debunked some of their misconceptions and put forth revealing context as being only one of many fanatical Russian religious sects. When some of the locked up Freedomites read it, they actually started to change their tunes a little. Younger Freedomites began working in the prisons, asking for other books and school teachers, and slowly shed their traditional emo attitude. Today, 14 have been paroled, and Canadian Canadian officials proudly announced that the first returnees to Freedomite lands applied for government land office to buy the land. For the first time, Freedomites will be land-owning, tax-paying citizens. True Way Cult comes in at number 4. Originally a professor in Taiwan for 9 years, after 37 years an atheist, he woke up one day, first religious revelation. A voice said to pursue religion, so he did. He studied every religious text he could find and then joined a UFO cult. Hated the leader, so he dipped and took about a dozen of the followers with him to start his own cult. He gained them fast and had them open up satellite churches by 1996. What were their beliefs, you may ask? Well, he claimed that 99% of the Buddhist temples in Taiwan were led by vampiric outside spirits, the Jesus reincarnate lived in Vancouver, the universe is 4.5 trillion years old, our solar system was created by nuclear war, we each have 3 souls, and that humanity has been rescued on 5 occasions by God descending in a flying saucer. Their whole goal was, as people increase their spiritual light during the time on Earth, they would be able to escape karmatic reincarnation. This meant achieving enlightenment, the state of being that their leader Chen also called Buddhahood. Chen pulled his followers' tails a ridiculous amount. He had them move from Taiwan to America, which only 150 of his few thousand followers could even do, live in cramped conditions, give him their money. The final escalation is when Chen told them on March 31st, 1998 at 12:01 a.m. God would appear before the world on a single TV channel in the USA. When this prophecy failed, he stared into the sun for a while in front of his followers and reporters and stated that no mere man could have done it for that long. He had them shake their own hands and speak out loud and claimed that that is proof of God being everywhere and in everyone, so technically his prophecy didn't fail and he wasn't wrong. His followers began to dwindle and eventually disbanded due to unfulfilled prophecies and visa issues, as cult member is not a valid reason to renew a tourism visa. Considered Christians anti-cult is number 3. To explain, an anti-cult pastor preaching about cult became a cult. Okay, known as Monty, Kim Miller founded the Concerned Christians to speak against mind control perpetrated by religious extremists as well as keep Christianity apocalyptic and severe. Monty was never raised religious. In fact, his first exposure was the Christian club at the university, which seemingly had him convert almost overnight. He directly enjoyed the concept that no one belonged to themselves, rather that humans were purchased at the cost of Christ's blood and thus everyone belonged to Christianity. That's not the best reason to be a convert. He was hostile to anyone he deemed sacrilegious, but usually Monty condemned easy targets like liberal churches and cults, which gave him credibility as a preacher for discrediting perceived false teachings. But sometimes giving someone an audience is a bad thing, i.e. Donald Trump. His disciples failed to notice his message and personality were shifting because his charismatic delivery remained so compelling. His message was now that they were selected by God to be the only true church and that they must abide by the holy laws and spiritual regulations. He used tactics he'd learned watching cults to isolate and control his flock, cutting ties from local churches and organizations. Forced to live in group homes, they were also forced to pour all their money and resources into Monty. An absurd $100,000 per family per year was expected. As his financial situation worsened, Monty took all assets from families and began the prophecy of his own death in late 1999 and that they needed to go to Jerusalem for his death, despite their aggressive anti-Semitism. The group departs suddenly overnight, leaving gifts for their family behind. The families obviously alert authorities and cult members were desperately searched for. Some of these devotees were found in Israel, but the rest were never found. Leader Monty was one of those that still hasn't been located, but rumors imply he may just be hiding for tax evasion, fraud, and lawsuits in Greece. The Seekers is number 2. If you live in Oak Park, Chicago, 1954, your Christmas Eve may have been interrupted by a group of carolers not singing but rather screeching at the sky. 200 people amassed to watch the carolers and police arrived to investigate the commotion. They found the Seekers, led by 54-year-old Dorothy Martin, who egged on her followers in the promise that a spaceship would come rescue them from Earth, while those who stayed behind were doomed to perish in a cataclysmic flood. Dorothy claimed to be able to speak with these aliens, which started one day in 1953 when she was sitting home alone. She says her mind went blank, her arm went numb, and then pins and needly, and she placed a pen in her numb hand and apparently wrote messages from spirits. She learned every time she kept her mind blank, she could channel first her dead dad, then aliens. She meets Michigan State physician Charles at a New Age aliens group, which has a small group of like-minded adults seeking access to extraterrestrial knowledge. They believed Dorothy to be a conduit and followed her quickly, just in time for her to receive a very out-of-pocket message from her alien guides of a coming apocalypse and a chance to evade it in the form of a UFO landing in a nearby airbase. No such UFO arrived though, and Dorothy felt like a failure until her alien buddy told her that the rising of a sunken empire would flood much of Earth, and UFO Round 2 was set to land later in 1954. They set out pamphlets and letters trying to warn the world. Before the 24th, there were 2 other false alarms. The seekers were grasping at straws, as was Dorothy. So when they were told to go out and sing carols to call the aliens on Christmas Eve, they did. But they never came. Nothing ever changed, and the seekers simply went home one by one, and Dorothy went to a mental institute. And in at number 1 today is the virtual reptilian cult by Shivari Shriner. Born in a severely religious home, there's no doubt it attributed to the religion-based delusions Shivari Shriner experienced as a child and into adulthood, as even she claims she was proclaiming God's name by the age of 2, and she was reborn by the age of 5, and by age 12 she'd read the Bible cover to cover and had a fascination with the book of Revelations for its strange imagery and apocalyptic predictions. She developed horrific haunting night terrors, and she believed they were because Jesus was not Jesus and instead the son of Satan, and Jesus that they had believed to be executed on the cross was actually Satan's son, so he's wrongly worshipped. She believed her night terrors were this Satan's son, who realized what she knew and sieged her sleeping brain so she couldn't tell the good Christians of the world they thought worshipped a false idol. Whew. She'd given herself a new title as King David's granddaughter as well, and she believed that she had also discovered the alien agenda and that aliens are paranormal and creating the biggest deception of all time, and they aren't extraterrestrial but subterranean and live amongst us in secret underground bunkers. It's the early 2000s, so Shivari hits YouTube to tell the world her theory. Between that and her web domain in 2004, Shivari had an online following of 2,100 people who also believed that demonic alien reptiles were sent by Satan to take over the world. After lots of money grubbing and Shivari becoming rich off of snake oils, this goofy nightmare ends in tragedy when a follower of Shivari takes her own life on Shari's advisement, and another had his significant other take his. Shivari passes away not long after herself in 2018, anticlimactic from natural causes. You can still visit her active website and YouTube channel today though.
Starting off in our number 10 spot, we have the Movement for the Restoration of the 10 Commandments of God. This cult with the catchiest name was founded in Uganda by 4 ex-Roman Catholic priests, 2 ex-nuns, and 1 former sex worker, and it was initially said to really emphasize the 10 Commandments. Apparently, these leaders thought that the Roman Catholic Church had really just abandoned the 10 Commandments, and they wanted to bring back some rules. They couldn't just focus on these rules, however, they also had to have some sort of doomsday prophecy as well, like all good cults do. They claimed that the apocalypse would come on December 31st, 1999, and in anticipation of this, a bunch of the members sold all of their possessions, so of course, they were pretty irritated when the world in fact did not end. The leaders scrambled and instead altered their predictions, saying that the Virgin Mary would instead come on March 17th, 2000, and that she would bring them all to heaven. The followers continued to believe this, and on March 16th, they had a huge feast. The following day, on March 17th, police arrived to where the cult resided and found that an explosion and fire killed hundreds of members of the group. At first, they thought this could have been a voluntary event, but soon they saw the signs that pointed to this being a mass killing. The leaders likely took the lives of the followers because they could not pay them back, and they also knew that their quote-unquote prophecies were false. At first, it was thought that the leaders were among those whose bodies were found, but that isn't quite the case. No one is exactly sure if they ended up losing their lives, or if they instead fled the country, which many believe to be the case. At this point, there is still a warrant out for their arrest, so while the authorities have never officially confirmed that they are on the run, it truly is the most likely scenario. In our number 9 spot today, we have Shinrikyo. This cult was founded by a man named Shoko Asahara, and he claimed to be the reincarnation of the Hindu god Shiva. He said that he was destined to lead his followers to salvation once the apocalypse came, but then once he lured in followers, he claimed he could also teach them to levitate and develop telepathic abilities. Apparently, those who were the most skeptical, he allowed them to drink his bathwater. Not really seeing the connection on that one, to be totally honest, but those are just the facts. The cult continued to grow and drew in influential and wealthy people, and this is where things really took a turn for the worst. This group went on to attack Tokyo in 1994, which took the lives of 7 people. Then, in 1995, they released gas into the Tokyo underground, which led to 12 deaths, 50 injured people, and more than 5,000 people with temporary vision problems. In the end, Asahara and 11 of his disciples ended up being arrested and charged for these crimes, and after standing trial, they were all sentenced to death in 2004. In our number 8 spot today, we have the Narcosatanists. Founded by a man named Adolfo de Jesus Constanzo, he was at one point a dealer, and also the leader of a horrifying cult that was nicknamed the Narcosatanists by the media. Adolfo's followers believed that he had magical abilities, but in the worst way possible. He required his followers to kidnap young men, who Adolfo would practice horrible, sadistic rituals on, and ultimately take their lives in order to replenish this magic that didn't exist. It's an absolutely horrific story, and this carried on for years until the disappearance of Mark Kilroy. Mark was a Texas college student who was in Mexico for some fun over spring break in 1989, but sadly during this trip he was taken by the cult's followers. Mark's friends quickly noticed his disappearance and began searching for him, and this led to a border-crossing manhunt, and authorities quickly revealed what had been going on, but Adolfo had already fled. He and 4 of his followers fled to Mexico City, and this is how he was finally caught. Police were called to the apartment they were staying at as a result of a totally unrelated dispute, but because Adolfo knew that they were looking for him, he just assumed that they were there for him and he opened fire with a machine gun. Not wanting to go to prison, he then handed the weapon over to one of his followers and asked him to open fire on himself, and by the time the police were able to reach the apartment, he was already dead. In the end, 14 cult members were charged for their crimes relating to everything that went on. In our number 7 spot today, we have the Children of God. Karen Zerbe is the leader of the cult now known as the Family of Love, but is much better known by its former name, the Children of God. In 1969, Karen joined a group called Teens for Christ and ended up becoming the personal secretary to David Berg, who is one of the founders of the group. Eventually, David would divorce his wife in order to marry Karen. Karen had a son named Ricky, and his childhood was made into a book which was used to show other members of the cult how they should raise their children, but the book included some pretty horrific and disturbing content. At first, Karen wasn't around or extremely active in the cult, but she began to insert herself more and began making rules and enforcing discipline. Once David began to get sick in 1988, Karen took over the leadership position that she had been groomed for. After David passed away, she married another leader from the cult, and all the while, Karen was extremely elusive, so much so that some of the followers didn't even know what she looked like. This cult has actually seen a few celebrities over the years. Jeremy Spencer, who is one of the founding members of Fleetwood Mac, is a member of this cult. Joaquin Phoenix and his siblings were unfortunately subject to this terrible cult when they were growing up, but they all chose to leave later in life and as adults have spoken out about it. Unfortunately, Karen is still active as the cult's leader, even though she most definitely should be in prison, and she still remains in hiding, living off of what money she could collect from followers. In our number 6 spot today, we have the Rajneesh movement. Bhagwan Shree Rajneesh first became known in the 1960s as he traveled through India speaking out against socialism as well as aspects of mainstream religion. While speaking out about these things, he also advocated for a more open attitude when it came to human sexuality, and it's this stance that quickly earned him the nickname the sex guru. By the 1980s, he had taken his teachings to the United States, where he opened a facility known as Rajneesh Puram in Wasco County, Oregon, but this quickly upset the locals in the area. Not only were there legal battles surrounding his construction, but there were also crimes being committed by the followers of the Rajneesh movement. And we're talking about really serious crimes. There was a mass food poisoning attack with the Salmonella bacteria, which marked the first known bioterrorism attack in the history of the United States. And if this wasn't bad enough, there was also the attempted assassination of United States Attorney Charles H. Turner. Rajneesh didn't take any responsibility for these crimes and instead blamed his personal secretary and her supporters, but despite this denial, he still found himself deported, after which he returned to India. Here he continued to run the Poon Ashram until his death in 1990. Honestly, the story is absolutely bonkers, the crimes are massive, and the entire thing is just very bizarre.
Mithracism. Like my duck duck goose joke, did I ruin it by asking? Probably. Mithra, the most important of Iranian gods, represented the sun, justice, contact, and war. And in Rome, during the 2nd and 3rd century CE, Mithra was the god of kings, a mutual obligation between the ruler and his warriors. The Mithratic sanctuaries were caves, which presented obvious limitations for ritual attendees, and the maze of underground tunnels leading to them acted as a labyrinth initiation. The initiates were organized into 7 grades: Raven, Bridegroom, Soldier, Lion, Persian, Courier, the Son, and the Father. Each rank had a mask resembling their assigned role or a dress if you're the bridegroom. No organizational hierarchy seems to have existed, and only men were admitted to the religion. Little is known about the initiation ceremonies as well. Ancient texts refer to baptisms and purifications and chastisements, as well as some fetters and liberations. Simulated or potentially real deaths and resurrections were part of ceremony, and murals at Capua in Italy show that the initiatives were blindfolded, kneeling, and prostrate prostrated. Tertullian, the 2nd century North African theologian, describes the test of courage assigned to the bridegroom. Weapon in hand, he'd have to force his way to a wreath, then once he succeeded, an official offered him a crown with the wreath. The candidate had to decline, saying Mithra alone was his wreath, and I don't know, maybe that was a big deal or something. In search of answers, cults were accepted and normalized in the Han Imperial Cult. During the reign of the Han Emperor Wu, the imperial government sponsored a large number of cults, many of which were connected to the emperor's own pursuit of immortality, whether it was the avoidance of death altogether, or transcendence, or some combination of the two. The cults worshipped by the emperor or on his behalf were spread out across the empire, and Wu frequently traveled to perform sacrifices or visit these sacred locations. The number of cults grew over the course of the Emperor Wu's reign, and there were frequent changes to sacrificial locations and sacrificial rites. The emperor believed that it was important for him to rule over a unified territory in order to perform the legendary sacrifices performed as the Yellow Theach had done before him to become immortal. As such, the emperor took over control of territory containing important cult locations and the 5 sacred peaks. The emperor also attempted to access the powers of local spirits to somehow demonstrate his authority over them and of the land of his empire. Many cults that they had established were disbanded after the emperor's death. We have no information about the practice of these cults when the emperor was not involved, however. And now for a cult that quite literally had the Book of the Dead. Archaeologists discovered a temple in 2021 when they were excavating the Saqqara, an ancient Egyptian burial site. That's right, y'all, recent discoveries. The monument was erected in Queen Neret's honor. The structure was situated next to a pyramid of her husband, Pharaoh Teti, who had ruled Egypt from approximately 223 BC to 2291 BC. Near the pyramid, a team of Egyptian archaeologists found the series of burial shafts containing the remains of people who lived during the 18th and 19th dynasties. These burials were part of Teti worshipping cults that had formed after the pharaoh's death. The cult seems to have remained active for more than a millennia, with people wanting to be buried near the pharaoh's pyramid. So far, the team has uncovered more than 50 wooden coffins, as well as offerings and bizarre cult items. One of the most fascinating objects found in the burial shafts is the 13-foot-long papyrus that contained the chapter 17 of the Book of the Dead, a manuscript from ancient Egypt used to help guide the deceased through the afterlife. Other discoveries are bronze axe, board game, limestone stela, some other cool stuff. There are also many shrines and statues of Anubis, and the rest is a mystery for now. Now, an Egyptian god being worshipped in Greece, the cult of Isis. This goddess gained prominence in Greece and Rome after 300 BCE. She had prominent temples, a dedicated priesthood, and devoted followers. She was believed to influence fertility and agriculture, but as her worship spread to new areas, this changed to fit the needs of her followers. The cult of Isis concerned itself with the myth of death and rebirth of Osiris, how Osiris's brother Seth was so envious of Osiris's rulership of Egypt and the Nile, he cuts him into many pieces. Osiris's wife Isis then gathered the pieces together, ate them, and gave birth to Osiris, resurrecting him. The cult mainly concerned itself with the concepts of material sacrifice, like fasting and donating, rituals involving revelations. Unlike the mystery religions, there were both yearly rituals and daily sacrifices. Not only this, but there was very public displays of devotion to Isis, with temples, devoted priests, and worships in her honor, as well as the annual Navigium Isidius. They weren't underground by any means. In fact, evidence shows that the cult of Isis was the largest competitor for the new cult, Christianity, in the empire, especially concerning the inclusion of women as priests and worshippers equally. In fact, it played a huge influence on Christianity. The iconograph of the Virgin Mary bears similarity to Isis, and Isis's titles such as the Queen of Heaven are still used to refer to the Virgin even today. Finally, Osiris's promise of eternal life through sacrifice for his followers has clear parallels to early Christian understandings of Christ. Last but not least is Boiled Head, Sanctuary of the Falcon. Archaeologists were casually conducting field research along the Red Sea's coast in 2019 and, humbly discover an entire lost shrine. The team came across the temple ruins while excavating Berenike, an ancient Ptolemaic Roman port. The 2-room shrine was decorated and designed in Egyptian style. However, the previous worshippers were not Egyptian. They belonged to an enigmatic Blehemes, a semi-nomadic tribe attempting to assimilate. The site on which the shrine was found, called the Northern Complex, consists of multiple buildings, including hints at the beliefs of the Blehemes, including inscriptions of their kings. In the rear room, the archaeologists identified a podium on which a statue of their god would have been placed, and a broken stand of which offerings for the god would have been placed. Perhaps the most notable, however, were the 735 animal remains, fish, bird, mammals, and eggshell fragments, all sacrificed for the Egyptian moon god Khonshu, who they began to worship. In a fascinating twist, the temple content suggests the Blehemes had embraced Egypt's existence and their religion so well, they politely redeveloped their sacrifice practices to be more comfortable for the average Egyptian, sacrificing falcons by chopping heads off and boiling them instead of human humans. However, this temple found has a strict no boil zone. See that sign? Yeah, when the inscription's translated, it says it is improper to boil a head in here. In at number 10 is the Brethren, and it's way less cooler than it sounds. Living an almost Amish way of life, this pilgrim-esque cult is actually led currently by one of Forbes' richest men alive, who lives in a $5 million mansion while his followers aren't even allowed to travel outside of their communities. They have small sites around the world and follow some extreme expectations such as men must work at their exclusive businesses, women stay at home. Brethrens are not permitted to eat at non-Brethren restaurants, stay in hotels, or even live in apartment buildings in a non-member neighborhood. They can't have a swimming pool or use a computer unless it was created and approved for Brethren use by a Brethren company. The internet is a pipeline to filth, so Brethren businesses provide cell phones and computers with a software called WordX that permits only word processing, spreadsheets, accounting programs, and email, but no internet. Women are only to dress from neck to wrist and neck to ankle coverage styles and have a ribbon or scarf in their overtly long hair. Men need to be clean shaven and dress in business casual. Brethren children are to live at home with their parents until the day that they are married. Typically the women get married young because their purpose is to be a dutiful wife and produce lots of children. The Brethren genuinely believe that those on the outside of the cult, especially those who left, are evil and living life wrong. Getting kicked out or withdrawn from in this community keeps members in check, as losing this lifestyle means being condemned to hell to them. It can be argued between their Messiah being a man of God figure that changes from one billionaire to another every so often, and their exclusive, strict, and elitist premises is that these qualities seem to be an antithesis of what religious movements are supposed to be. But I guess that's up to their eccentric billionaire god. In at number 9 is Crazy for Coconuts. It's a little confusing, but here goes. This German nudist dude, August Engelhardt, was so devoted to the consumption of coconuts that he started a cult about them. Loving nothing more than chafing sand and a good sunbird, Engelhardt loved sunlight and the tropics. So he started a group of like-minded individuals in Papua New Guinea. While the others were a little more normal at first, Engelhardt went hard and only consumed coconuts from day one. He was convinced that the sun was the source of all life, and the coconut, because it grew on top of palm trees closer to the sun than any other food, was clearly the best food in the world. He used his big fat inheritance to publish journals about his coconut beliefs in order to develop what he called the Order of the Sun, wherein members would worship the sun with him. It worked, mostly because it was his money that was shipping people out there. Free relocation to the tropics to eat fruit and dance nude under the sun. Come on, even I'd pack up, let's be real. Even at its peak, the cult never hit 100 members because they had a bad habit of, well, not surviving, only eating coconuts. There were no doctors, and this is an island known for venomous animals and potential illnesses that can be hard to treat. Accidents were also an issue, as many of these people had no idea how to navigate island living and were also physically weakened from, you guess it, only eating coconuts. Even Engelhardt was eventually wasting away from coconut exclusive dieting. He couldn't walk, was severely malnourished, afflicted with ulcers, he weighed under 100 pounds and was having seizures, all thanks to a diet of non-stop coconut and generally poor living conditions. Number 8 is one I struggle not to laugh about. It's the Prince Philip movement. Prince Philip had many titles and honors being a British royal, but did you know in a remote South Pacific colony he was actually believed to be a deity? This is a wild ride, but the Prince Philip movement, a sect followed by the Yehonanan tribe on southern island of Tanna and Vanuatu, believed him to be the pale son of an ancient mountain spirit. The origins of Philip's divine status and why he's assumed to be the spirit's son is unclear. It's believed this mountain spirit's son, though, would travel to a distant land marrying a powerful lady and in time return, which solidified to the people of Tanna the belief that Philip was the embodiment of the spirit when he and the queen visited Vanuatu in 1974, when he was still unaware of his status as a deity there. The love of Philip was so strong that the British resident commissioner in Vanuatu requested the special photographs on behalf of the people, which Philip actually granted. In return, they sent him a pig slaughter club that he posed with at Buckingham Palace for them. He also met privately with a group of 5 Tanna community members that were flown to Britain for a reality show meet and greet. The photographs of Prince Philip remained with the chief Jack Nevaeh, who died in 2009, having never saw his dream of the Duke's return to Tanna realized. For decades, 2 villages on the Vanuatuan island of Tanna have revered the Duke of Edinburgh as a godlike spiritual figure. At his passing, the peoples mourned deeply, and BBC BBC reported that a private message to the Queen Elizabeth had even been given to journalists at scene, who conveyed it to the British officials before her passing. This one is kind of wacky in a fun way. Number 7 is Raelism. Rael has had a colorful life. Race car driver, cabaret singer, and alien communicator. He called the aliens the Elohim, and the pitch of his cult is that the Elohim are historically mistaken for gods by ancient civilizations and are the explanations for many of the great wonders of the world and historic advancements. He says Elohim had hybrid children with humans that were prophets to humanity for news about their origins. Examples of these prophets were said to be Buddha, Gandhi, Muhammad, Jesus, and of course Rael himself. They also believed Earth is in the age of apocalypse and we need to harness new scientific and technological development for peaceful purposes, and that when this has been achieved, the Elohim will return to Earth and share their technology with humanity to establish a utopia. As a result, on their compound in France and then Quebec, Raelians have sought to build an embassy for the Elohim that incorporates a landing pad for their spaceships, as well as gardens and temples. Rael's other interests included rampant banging, so of course he had a harem with the fun title Order of Angels. He was also super into the idea of cloning and created Clonade, an organization that engaged in the research of human cloning, but their 2002 claim of a successful clone is highly scrutinized, as no scientific proof was found, and it was also brought to the public attention. Most of the staff had no education in science. Regardless, the international Raelism movement claims tens of thousands of members, the majority in the francophone areas of Western Europe and North America and parts of East Asia. They often attract younger members due to their endorsement of LGBTA and women's rights, as well as aid in climate and nuclear protests. Also, the aliens apparently promised us alien pleasure bots, so I think some people just want to see if that's for real. My feet-phobic people, it's time to tune out. Number 6 is the foot reading cult. Let's unpack this whole disaster. To start, leader Hogen Fukunaga claims to be the reincarnation of both Jesus and Buddha and can diagnose followers' problems by simply examining their feet, and that they would die if they were not examined appropriately. But in reality, he is a money-grubbing millionaire who took advantage of the sick and fearful. New members were initiated by being forced to stay up for days and run around the streets yelling cheesy self-help book lines like "I am living a happy and healthy life." After they'd have the joyous opportunity of being shoved into private rooms where they're intimidated by thugs into giving the cult more money. Hogan charged a whopping $900 per foot reading sessions, and people who are conducting said foot readings are not qualified medical professionals in any way and have no idea what they're talking about. They take advantage of desperate people who come in for sessions looking for answers and end up leaving paying obscene amounts of money on sessions, ornaments, scrolls, books. There are numerous accounts of people who failed to attend all of Fukunaga's sessions and are guilt-tripped, told that they would die or their illnesses were their own fault. In 1987, the group gained official recognition as a religious corporation, and the businessman started raking in over $30,000 monthly from his scams. Naturally, the authorities are on his tail for tax evasion and 3 lawsuits of fraud, which in a 1-year window after turned into 1,000 lawsuits of fraud, totaling in 5.4 billion yen owed. Here we go again with the Brethren at number 5. If you watch part 1 of our bizarre cults, you may think I'm revisiting the same cult. Don't worry, I'm not lazy, it's just that cult leaders aren't creative with their names. This Brethren cult was founded by the late Jim Roberts, a preacher's son. He had practiced sermon by 15 and later served in the Marines. This combination of strict religion and disciplinary Marine Corps made for a hardened man with some unique ideology. In Chicago, his religious philosophy paired with leadership skills, charisma, and an air of authority allowed him to gain a small group of congregants by visiting college campuses and public areas. He had about 100 followers under a tight-knit hold at the time he ordered everybody to drop out of society nomad style in 1971. He had explained the decision in order to secure a place in heaven, people had to begin purifying themselves, according to the passages of the Bible. Brethren must forsake their families and friends and all material goods. You sew your own clothing and you eat from the dumpster. And of course, all money goes to the leader. Laughing and dancing are a huge no-no, as are children playing and anyone accessing medicine or medical care. Naturally, the cult has been accused of negligence for allowing its members to suffer or even die from perfectly curable illnesses. The only acceptable transport to them is bikes, buses, and hitchhiking to get around. Men wear their hair short and have long beards, and women wear long tunic dresses. Women, of course, are subservient to men, and everyone was subservient to Roberts while he was still alive. In 2015 that changed, as Robert passed from cancer left undiagnosed from his hatred of medicine. But most converts didn't change anything and remained nomadic. Many are still out there. Thanks to the coordinated efforts by parents of cult followers who created the Roberts Group Parent Network, several members have managed to be deprogrammed and returned home. Ikanakar, a fun word that I'm probably pronouncing wrong, is number 4. Ikanakar and all its frivolousness was made possible by founder Paul Twitchell in 1965. It's a New Age religion group, and like many other New Age religion groups, it was really just code for a jumble of mysticism and Eastern philosophy mixed with yoga, meditation, tarot cards, and made-up iconography. Believing all members have ancient roots going back 10,000 years, they were to be given a new name and learn the secretive language of the Ekanars. All of it done in the name of the group's meditation ritual where one chants, "Ha!" and separates their soul from their body. Dreams are regarded as important teaching tools, and members often keep journals to facilitate studies. Ekanar teaches that spiritual liberation in one's lifetime is available to all, that it is possible to achieve self-realization. This group started in Minnesota, Canada, and it's now spread throughout the country, and it's made its way to others such as Europe and Asia, but it's primarily practiced here in North America. Since Twitchell's passing, this group has had several successors and remains popular today. Despite being a registered non-profit, the group sells its founders materials for a hefty profit, and there are allegations that virtually all of the books are plagiarized. Come on, you know by now cults love fraud. Happy Science could have you looking sad in number 3. Far-right nationalism meets New Age spiritualism in the Japanese Happy Science cult. Founded by Ryuhei Okawa in 1986, he had been a cult member himself in the Godlight Association. Okawa decides to dip and start his own cult of personality when he realized that being a cult leader could prove to be a lot more profitable than being an anonymous corporate employee and a cult follower. Okawa pitches in his sermons that he is a human incarnation of a supreme being called El Cantare, who combines Christ and Buddha and Muhammad and every other prophetic deity to create a 9-dimensional heaven with him at the head, and of course can communicate with the celestial. He predicts that some of these celestials might visit us one day bearing the apocalypse. He's also convinced that there's a space alliance that forbids any kind of interstellar attacks or war between planets. Apparently some representatives could already be here, living among us, so remember that the next time you start trash talking the aliens. Here's where the strangeness picks up a notch. He also created a massively complex mythology of New Age nonsense while simultaneously founding an extremist political wing called the Happiness Realization Party. His party advocates the vicious Japanese nationalism devoted to denying historical cruelties, advocating for conflict with China and North Korea, and to rebuild Japan's infrastructure. The group claims to have 12 million members around the world, has multimedia arm, and enjoys a tax-exempt status in the USA as a church. Let's get biblical. Number 2, the 12 tribes. So sorry for how cringy that was. The 12 tribes take holistic and traditional practices to exploit under the guise of New Age hippiedom. The Christian fundamentalist cult was born in 1970s, led by Albert Eugene Spriggs and his wife Marcia in Tennessee. They advertise their nature communes and 70s themed diners and cafes, whilst behind closed doors, their practices are far less than free love. There is a belief that slavery was a marvelous opportunity for black people, and the support of conversion camps for the LGBTA who they think the world should be rid of. The 12 Tribes tries to keep its extremist teachings from outsiders and even some of their inside members, but former members and experts on fringe religious movements who have helped followers escape paint a pretty horrific picture of life in the group. Black and LGBTA members especially suffer, as once indoctrination is over, members change tune and become aggressive towards them. Their followers sacrifice their earthly possessions to live in any of the many communes and follow the teachings of the modern-day apostle with no deviation, lest they risk being ostracized by the cult and damned to an apocalyptic lake of fire. Members must work for free in the commune stores and cafes. Their access to internet, secular books, movies, everything, worldly influences of any kind are extremely restricted. In its 50 years running, 12 Tribes distinguish itself from other tribes with legal businesses, operations such as food services, construction, soap making, woodworking, farming, solar energy, and even an Alaskan fishing operation. By members living communally, sharing money and resources, and all businesses staffed by followers who work without pay, ex-members told the Denver Post this is how the cult perfectly constructed to leave you with nothing should you choose to leave. This next cult is one of unbelievable brutality. It's the Narcosatanists at number 1. Okay, so that's a word and a half, but it essentially means the satanic doobie dealers led by Adolfo de Jesus Costanzo. Its members were traffickers and deeply disturbed people. Having studied Palo Mayombe from a young age, Adolfo took fascination with the concept of remains having religious purposes and affiliations. This fascination grew, and while Palo isn't inherently evil and can be used for great good, Adolfo was also exposed to his mother's criminal behavior and criminal consorts as a child, as well as rampant poverty, which were huge influences on his future life of crime. I'm going to keep this vague because the victims deserve to be acknowledged more than the crime. After moving back to Mexico as a teen, Adolfo made a group of friends who indulged his radical and bizarre opinions about the benefits of animal and even human sacrifice in the name of deities. They began to run a profitable business casting spells to bring good luck using Adolfo's Palo background and some made-up mojo, involving expensive ritual sacrifices of chickens, goats, snakes, zebras, and lion cubs. Many gangs and high-ranking politicians visited the group on their ranch property for these spells. It's here the group indulged in the use of heavy substances, and the religious factor was metamorphosized into dark magic intensely. Believing the magic he took from Palo Mayombe may be the success of their cartel and the spell business, Adolfo realized that if the dead bones in his Nganga altar worked this well, how well would live ones? Tragically, this realization resulted in the sacrifice of over 20 people, which most had incredibly inhumane ends. The cycle breaks, however, with Mark Kilroy, an American who had been abducted and sadly perished by the group's hand. American authorities put pressure on Mexico and forced their police to find out that a cult leader had been under their noses all along. Adolfo refused to go to prison and went down in a literal blaze of glory, never facing punishments for his crime. 14 other members were arrested and charged, and American authorities still wait for the release of 3 of these members from life sentences in Mexico for their turn to be prosecuted in the USA. We're gonna start with one as old as creation itself, the cult of Amun. So, the reason certain branches of ancient religious god worship can be considered cults, and others are just normal worship and ritual, is based upon the level of devotion and credit a deity is given. Think of a modern cult, where your leader dictates all your decisions and thinking. In ancient cults that worship gods, they did the same, but without that god presently physically there to dictate them, the cult followers simply had to look to doctrine and legends. Amun was, to begin with, the local deity of Thebes, and when it was in an unimportant town. But when a Theban family took the throne in the 11th century of Egypt, they catapulted their favorite deities into national prominence. Amun became seen as a creator, the reason for life. More of the temples were erected in his honor, and his devout worship began. As 18th dynasty progressed, Amun, who had become merged with the god Ra to become Amun-Ra, cults grew in wealth and power. Soon, the cult rivaled that of the pharaoh in power and prestige, and one of the important positions in the cult was the wife of Amun, usually the queen or the queen mother associated with the pharaoh. But there was also a high-rank oracle and priests who controlled them. This cult's rituals remain largely mysterious due to what we know of them, and due to the fact that Akhenaten's decision to declare Aten the only god in Egypt destroyed a bunch of the temples and statues of all the others. Now to Greece, where their ancient society is famous for many things, but most especially cults. Let's talk Magna Mater, properly called the cult of Cybele. It came to Greece around the 5th century BCE with the ancient Indo-European people known as Phrygians. The ancient Turkish goddess was one of fertility, was believed to reside on mountaintops where, accompanied by lions, she ruled over the natural world. Then came the Attis part. Apparently Attis was a mortal who had spurned Cybele's romantic advancement, so she punished him with insanity, causing him to cut off his own junk and die. Eventually, Cybele had a change of heart and petitioned Zeus to allow Atticus to be resurrected. So, what did every priest in this cult do? Well, March 24th was known as the Day of Blood to the followers of Cybele. That is when some of her priests would make the same cut off themselves and offer up their blood on her altars. With their love of virility, the Romans took a dim view of this decision for men. For the cult to flourish in Rome, a substitution had to be developed. For those who wanted to celebrate Cybele but remain intact, they could sacrifice a bull instead of bulls. The Terrabolium, a ritual bull slaughter that, according to one admittedly hostile late Roman account, involved initiatives positioning themselves below the bull and showering in its blood. Speaking of cults with branches, how about one wacky cult that led to another, but they have opposite beliefs? Part 1. Clists. So, one day in 1645, while the Orthodox preacher Danila Filipovich is mowing his little cart over a hill in Russia, the Godhead himself descended upon Dan in his fiery cart, trailed by angels and seraphim to deliver godhood. That moment forward, Dan was the living God. He issued commandments like Moses. He announced that there was no teaching but his. From now on, the only book that mattered was the dove-like book written in the heart by the Holy Spirit. Okay, dude. After a decade, he meets Ivan Suslov, who's age 33, and decided to name this guy his Jesus Christ. According to legend, the dude did work miracles. Twice he was crucified and rose from the dead. The second time he was also flayed on the order of the Tsar, and when returned to Earth, a young girl covered him in a sheet that became his new skin. He levitated, he flew. With Danila, he visited heaven 3 nights in a row. Normal stuff. Suslov and Filipovich gained many followers. Their belief was that Jesus was born like any other man. He was no different from other men until age 30. Like Ivan, the Holy Spirit, like Dan, anointed him and made him God's son. And if the Holy Spirit could enter one man, it could enter others as well, even women. It stood to reason that there could be many Christs and many mothers of God. For all its prohibitions, the core of the Christian religious practice was about the conscious pursuit of ecstasy. Their little known rituals are that of religious self-degradation and punishment, but also of chasing pleasure, even if it's in the woods with a couple dozen muddy people. Fight sin with sin was the motto. The Clists offshoot came to the exact opposite conclusion. Part 2, the Scots. They made the suppression of at the absolute center of their belief. Like the Clists, the Scots practiced their faith in secret. Their symbol was the dove, their patron was St. George, and their instrument was the knife. They called the removal of down there the mounting of the white horse, or receiving the Great Seal. And apparently there were greater and lesser seals. To have your nipples and the boys removed meant you were becoming an angel. To remove the pecs or breasts entirely and your John itself made you an archangel. And by the way, before doing any of these removals, the Scots literally prepared for death potentially with a verbal farewell that sounds like the reading of the children's book Goodnight Moon. The Scots was founded by Kondraty Salivanov, who was raised in a Clist cult. A prophetess there told him that he was the true son of God, and he set out to preach pretty much the same stuff at the Clists, only with the bodily removal thing added. Eventually he had so many followers the authorities became alarmed. His disciples were exiled, he was imprisoned, and he claimed to be the deceased Tsar Peter III escaped from the grave. Peter's son Paul brings him out of jail, asks him, "Are you my dad?" Saliv replied that if Paul would take up his cause and cut a bunch of stuff off, "Bob's your uncle and I'm your spiritual dad." Paul did not. Instead, Saliv is confined to an asylum multiple times. Well, that was horrible. Let's talk about some caterpillar worshipping weirdos. 7th century cult. The Nihon Shoki was compiled in 720 CE to account for the creation of the world and the myths surrounding the birth of the Japanese nation. And in the year 644 AC, they list a hot new cult on the horizon, deifying an insect. A shaman named Uwaba no O disguised himself as a religious priest and went around preaching to people to abandon their belongings and submit themselves to Tokyo no Kami, who would then grant the devotees with wealth and longevity. Poor become rich, elderly become young again. Tokyo no Kami? This guy! The larvae of the Asian swallowtails. It's a big caterpillar. They apparently like Japanese citrus and pepper trees. Persuaded by oracles, witches, and wizards, and other believers he'd collected, peoples in towns and villages cast their food and belongings on the roadside and shouted, "The new riches have come." They also enshrined the insect on an altar and worshipped it with song and dance. The Nihon Shoki tells us after the followers of Tokyo no Kami cast away their possessions for no good reason, the loss and waste was extreme, and an official named Kawakatsu, the chief of the Hata clan, was so disgusted with the enormous waste and loss of rationale that he arrested and executed the cult leader.
In our number 5 spot today we have NXIVM. This cult was founded by a man named Keith Rainier, and on the surface level they marketed this group as a multi-level marketing company, but instead it was definitely a cult and a front for disgusting crimes. Keith started off this multi-level marketing career with the company Amway, and by 1990 he had started his own, which ended up getting shut down for being a pyramid scheme. In 1998, NXIVM was founded and was originally called a personal development company and was supposed to help with self-improvement. There was a 12-point mission statement which was recited during the cult classes where they purged themselves of all envy-based habits. There were different modules for classes like relationship sourcing, which helped the members explore ways that they could financially benefit if their partner passed away suddenly, or another class where they only learned about psychopaths and their followers. Eventually, the cult leaders started to branch out and form different organizations related to the cult, and long story long, this cult was not for self-improvement, but was involved in some extremely terrible things. In 2018, Keith was arrested and charged, and in June of 2019, he was convicted for conspiracy and conspiracy to commit forced labor, as well as a few other really awful things, and all of these charges were related to NXIVM. This story really blew up, especially due to the celebrity involvement of actor Allison Mack, who was also arrested for her involvement in the cult. In our number 4 spot today we have the Manson family. Started by the horrible Charles Manson, this story starts off when Manson was released from prison in 1967, where he then moved to San Francisco, where he gained a small following that would eventually go on to be the cult known as the Family. The group eventually moved to an abandoned ranch outside of Los Angeles, and it was here that Manson continued to brainwash his followers and manipulate them with his own religious philosophies. He is quoted as saying, quote, "I'm God to my friends, I'm the devil to my enemies. When I look to the future, I'm the prophet. When I must lay down the law for our earth, I'm the son of man." Manson claimed that there would be an upcoming race war in which white people would be killed, which was intended to instill fear in his followers. This was so that he could ignite a race war and send his followers on a killing spree, which ended up being the night of the horrible horrible Tate and LaBianca killings. This led to a reign of terror in the Los Angeles area for several months because people just couldn't understand how or why this happened. In our number 3 spot today we have Heaven's Gate. Started by Marshall Applewhite and his former partner Bonnie Nettles, the two founded the well-known cult Heaven's Gate. These two believed themselves to be something called walk-ins, which they said are higher beings who took control over the bodies of two middle-aged humans so as to spread their word and teach humanity. People who believed their story and were drawn in by the idea of these higher beings were of course being manipulated and taken advantage of, which is all too common in these cult stories and really is the basis for most of these kinds of stories. They gave up their lives and all worldly possessions in the belief that Earth was to be recycled and the only way to continue surviving would be to leave immediately. The time to leave Earth came in March of 1997 when Marshall claimed that they had a spacecraft that was traveling to the comet Hale-Bopp. The catch with this spacecraft, however, well, Marshall told them that they needed to stage all taking their own lives in order for the UFO to take them to another level of existence above humans. 39 members of this cult, including Marshall himself, took their lives over the course of the next few days. This was the largest event of this kind since the next point we're going to talk about, which brings me to number 2, the People's Temple Full Gospel Church. Jim Jones is certainly one of the most well-known people on this list for all of the wrong reasons. He is the man who claimed that he was the reincarnation of Jesus, Buddha, and Gandhi, and he founded the cult, which was originally called Wings of Deliverance, but he later changed the name to the People's Temple Full Gospel Church. After an expose in the New West magazine about the things going on in this cult, he ended up moving the group from the United States to Guyana. From here, there were claims of horrible things and human rights violations, which led to an investigation. People found out that some of the supposed members of this cult were actually being held against their will. In the end, with all of this going on, Jim managed to convince his followers to all take their lives in one massive, horrible event, and this day has gone on to become known as the Jonestown Massacre. A total of 918 people died that day, including Jim. In our number 1 spot today we have Synanon. What originally started out as a drug rehabilitation program founded by Charles Diedrich in 1958, things quickly changed and this began to turn into a sort of group that shared these truth-telling sessions. At first it was known as The Game before the 1970s when Synanon was officially born. The founder Charles, as he began to get some kind of power, he grew greedy and hungry for more. This led to him starting to charge insane fees for his members, as well as forcing the members to do extreme physical labor. This is all bad enough, but it gets worse. Anyone who tried to shut this little community down would be met with an attempted hit on their life. Charles developed a list for anyone who challenged Synanon, and this included a lawyer by the name of Paul Morantz, who actually almost died as a result of the hit that Charles had put on him. In 1991, Synanon finally met its end when it was shut down for tax fraud, destruction of evidence, and terrorism, and Charles passed away just 6 years later.